Good afternoon, and welcome to the first of our public events in the 2026 Bach Institute. We're delighted to be joined by an in-person audience and hopefully a larger audience online in the live stream, as well as our 2026 fellows. So today we'll be discussing, along with the helicopters and the other exciting events happening in Boston. Today we'll be discussing the cantata that will be presented in tomorrow's church service, Wer da gläubet und getauft wird, BWV 37. A couple of orientation things about the cantata. It's actually an Ascension Day cantata. That is not January. That is more middle to late May. The actual first performance of this cantata was May 18th, 1724. So if you're keeping score, that means that this is still in the first Jahrgang, the first year that Bach was in Leipzig. So he arrived and began writing cantatas in June of 1723. So he would have just been wrapping up his first year as he got to the Ascension holiday in 1724. So we'll go in a little later to why this particular cantata is being presented in January this year. But there's some interesting features of the piece. I want to just walk you through organization of the libretto, other things like that. So Ascension Day is a very important day in the Lutheran cycle. We don't find it as often marked in our present day services. Ascension Day will be followed by Trinity Sunday 10 days later. So we have this 40-day after, 40-day after Easter marking of when Christ ascends into heaven. And then another 10 days is Trinity Sunday, which is also known as Pentecost, right? So that's sort of when the disciples are given their final mission to go forth and preach the gospel. And that marks the end of the church year for the Lutherans. So we're very close to the end of the, actually it's the end of the first half of the church year, because the actual church year begins at Advent. And so there's sort of this demarcation. Pardon me. So Bach marks Ascension Day during his time in Leipzig with 4 cantatas. The one that I think is the best known is the Ascension Oratorio, which has the catalog number BWV 11. And that piece, in an oratorio style, really has strong narratives about the events, and there's even an aria where one of the disciples, or the human soul, is lamenting that he has to go away. Can't you stay a little longer? This piece, if you were thinking it's an Ascension piece, you might say, I didn't notice any particular mention of Jesus departing. So instead, the libretto is focusing on a very important tenet of Lutheran theology, which is that faith is much more important than good works. Luther really emphasized this because there was such a controversy with the Catholic Church, talking about how you could almost buy your way into heaven if you did enough good things. And Luther read the Bible and said, no, that cannot be the case. You must believe, right? So belief is really at the center of this piece. And as John Harbison points out in his brilliant notes, the opening chorus is based on a single line in Mark 16, which was the reading for that Ascension Day, which says, "He who has believed and has been baptized will be saved." But the second half of that verse is, "But he who has not believed or has disbelieved shall be condemned." And John points out that the decision not to include the second half of that sentence really seems to dictate the whole character of this cantata, and certainly of the opening movement. The sort of calm radiance of the piece is leading us towards this, come into the fold. We all believe, and this is a good thing, right? And of course, the libretto is going to continue to walk us through this examination of the importance of faith. In the second movement, the tenor aria, we're reminded that if you have faith, then you are one of the chosen ones, right? Jesus keeps this token, this badge, for those who are his own, right? Some other very beautiful language in that aria text, which we'll look at in depth, I think, when we go movement by movement. And then skipping over the exquisitely beautiful chorale fantasia, the recit and aria from the bass continues this point of emphasizing, he literally says, if you want to see God, you must not rely on good works. Instead, you must have this faith, which will then give you wings to soar to heaven. All right, so I'm going to ask Ryan, why are we doing this cantata in January?
Good question. Can everybody hear me? Yes? There are two reasons. One is there is the theme of baptism, which we leading up to the baptism of Jesus. And the other is that in this chorale fantasia, which you mentioned, really a chorale concerto, the third movement, takes the Epiphany hymn. We're currently in the season of Epiphany. Epiphany was, in fact, just this past Tuesday was the Feast of the Epiphany. So this is the first Sunday after Epiphany. And the well-known Epiphany hymn, Wie schön leuchtet der Morgenstern, is what the chorale concerto in the third movement is. And also, interestingly enough, in the very opening chorus, buried in the continuo line, the bass line, is the final phrase of Wie schön leuchtet der Morgenstern, is sort of buried, or one might say submerged, as the believer is when they're baptized, submerged. We hear that chorale tune, and that is sort of the basis for us choosing this work.
It's also just a scale, right?
Yes, it is a scale, but it is the scale that ends.
So the reason that I wanted to highlight that, we were having a conversation with the fellows about how at Emmanuel Church we select which cantatas we present, since we are presenting cantatas weekly, but only from September to May. And the lectionary for the contemporary Episcopal Church does not match exactly the lectionary for the 18th century German Lutheran Church. So there are many constraints that we have in terms of matching a cantata that will work for our service if it doesn't align perfectly with what was the occasion that Bach wrote the piece for. So the last time we did this, it was in May, and it worked so beautifully, but you can see how the rationale brings this cantata into an appropriate date for January.
So I find this opening chorus to be wonderful in many ways, but partially because this sunny glow of A major, that the very opening, there's a sense of warmth immediately in the first chord before you hear anything else. And then there's the brilliance with which Bach takes, as he so often does, he takes three different ideas and they're layered on top of each other. So the first idea we hear is the oboe, pom pom pi di di, which is the Pietà Gloria, which we'll hear later on. The basses sing it first. And the second idea you hear is the upper strings, yum bum 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 ba-da-dum, bum 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 ba-da-dum, bum 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 ba-da-dum. And that later on we hear the choir sing, "Wer da gläubet und getauft, wer da," tossed about, this little, almost dancing, blithe little figure. And the third thing we hear is the continuo that play, which is the final phrase of the Epiphany hymn, Wie schön leuchtet der Morgenstern. And in the midst of this, there's somewhat of a fourth thing in that you have the second oboe playing this sort of cascading line, dancing about everything else that's going on. I'll also note that the very opening, the basses sing, "Wir da gläubet," and they hang out for a long time, as does in the opening of the chorus, the first oboe does as well. And to me, I see it personally, my opinion is that this idea of believing in faith takes a long time to figure out. And there's a lot of holding on to something, almost convincing oneself that this is the case. We also have, it's as though Bach, very restrained forces. And I say that because the other three cantatas for Epiphany, the very next year, Cantata 128, the year after that, 43, both of those cantatas had trumpets and drums. You mentioned the Ascension Oratorio, trumpets and drums. Ascension Day was a big celebratory feast. But he chooses very modest forces for this. Only 2 oboes d'amore, strings, and choir. The other thing that I think is interesting, there are no recitatives, no secco recitatives. There's only this one accompagnato that the bass sings, which is very much like he's sermonizing. And I think you mentioned this, the sort of statement of the bedrock of the Lutheran faith, of that one only achieves salvation through faith, not from works alone. So to say they're modest forces, I think, is interesting too, because I mentioned this in our rehearsal. To me, the opening chorus has a sort of harmonic flavor and trajectory, almost of could be a piece by Mendelssohn or Bach, in the grandeur of it within these modest forces. So these sort of two worlds of modest forces with the grandeur of the vocal writing. The other thing I'll say about this is that the thing that I think Bach couldn't resist was just a little bit of text baiting. Every time the word getauft, we get yada yada, these little melismas, as though it's the flowing of the baptismal waters.
There are even some places where the voices drop quite significantly as they sing getauft. It was also noticeable, I would imagine you all noticed, that the chorus seems rather compact. There are pieces by Bach, opening choruses, that start the way this one does, and then they often have an episode with just orchestra and then another statement. And it actually feels a little bit like, wait, what happened to the rest of it? That I think is quite a striking aspect of this movement.
Yes, and I think it is a result of the choice to only do that one line of text from Mark. That we don't, one can imagine if he went on and talked about those who don't believe will be condemned, what would that musical treatment be like?
I want to just bring up a sort of implied question in everything we've said so far, which is, who wrote the libretto, right? Who compiled this libretto? These are questions that dog Bach scholarship pretty much throughout all of the cantata literature. And for pretty much all of the first Jahrgang, the first season of cantatas, we don't have a name. So many questions swirl around, especially when you don't know the poet. Now, how do we even know poets? Because many librettos were printed, sort of almost as if you were going to a concert. You could acquire a book of, say, 5 or 6 weeks of cantata libretti in advance before you attended church. So when these books survive, we have very important historical information that we can then compare. But unfortunately, many of them did not survive. And so without that, Bach was not in the habit of inscribing the name of the librettist in his scores, so we would never find that information there. That's usually, we look for these other sources, these printed materials that would allow us to be able to identify or surmise that someone wrote it. So it's very unfortunate that we have so many cantatas where the librettist is unknown. And another question that brings up as well is, did Bach just accept what he was given, or did he tweak it? Did he have some suggestions for the librettist, or did he just sort of do things on his own? For instance, how do we know that the librettist said, let's only set the first half of this verse? Or whether it was Bach's decision to create a piece of music with only, we don't know, right? But these, I think, are the very interesting sort of open-ended questions that we get when we're looking specifically at the text. It's in Bach's decision, generally you can tell what's meant to be a recit and what's meant to be an aria. That's a pretty conventional poetic form at this point. So it's, Ryan and I can both point to examples where something that was maybe meant to be an aria is turned into a recit. You know, that Bach seems to sometimes want to play with that. But in general, an aria is a much more regular poetic structure with even numbered lines and regular meter, often rhyming lines, whereas recits are more irregular and generally longer. And so it would be hard to set that kind of text as an aria, right? So that's a pretty simple, basic thing to know. But it is completely up to Bach which voice he uses. And there's always been a question in Bach cantatas, who makes the decision about the chorales? You know, which chorale happens to be at the end? Was that the librettist who made that decision, or did Bach make that decision? And in the case of the Morgenstern chorale concerto, as you're calling it, was that part of the libretto, or did Bach say, it would be nice to put this here? So the structure of the cantata as a whole, I think it has an incredibly beautiful integrity. People tend to think, oh, there's a codified format to Bach cantata. I expect an opening chorus. In fact, many people would say, I expect an opening chorus that has a chorale in it, right? And then there would be a recit and an aria, and another recit and another aria, and then a chorale. But in fact, if you were to do a statistical analysis of all of the the liturgical cantatas, I think you would find that there actually isn't a standard formula. That formula that I just quoted really conforms to the year of the chorale cantatas, which is Bach's second year in Leipzig. And again, we don't know who that librettist is, tragically, but there's a lot of internal evidence that makes us think it was one person who created all of those libretti. And therefore, he or she sort of seemed to have a formula. And those pieces are so magnificent that we sometimes just assume that is the model, that is the standard. But Bach didn't have a standard for how he wrote cantatas. And I think the form that this piece provides is a good example of how different the structure can be.
You mentioned things unknown as it relates to the libretto. There are a lot of things unknown with Bach, and what we do up here is a lot of conjecture. And as practitioners of the music, as performers of the music, we have a lot of decisions to make, and we can't live with the unknown. We have to, in some ways, make a decision and commit to it fully. And one of those decisions that we don't know is, what was the obligato instrument in the second aria, the tenor aria, the second movement? We believe, based on parts, that it could have been one or two instruments. It was an obligato instrument. It could have been a violin or an oboe. Those are the choices. And
Ryan, why do you ask that question? Why don't we know?
Oh, because the parts are missing. They don't exist anymore. Interestingly enough, we have, and I was reading about this recently, there's a digital copy of the second violin part, but not the first violin part. And we have the bass line for the aria and the tenor part. And we can tell from, if you just played the continuo line, there's something missing. So scholars, make an informed decision, there's something missing here. There must be an obligato part. And most have agreed that it's probably a violin part. There are a dozen or so different reconstructions of the violin part. Bob Levin, who we all know here in Boston, has done a reconstruction. Masato Suzuki from Bach Collegium, Japan, has done a reconstruction. And the one that you all heard today and we'll hear tomorrow is by our own John Harbison. And we've done that one, I think, the last 3 or 4 times. We've also done the Levin. In fact, Heidi, our violinist, and I think in a moment of uncertainty, wrote to me yesterday and said, wait, which reconstruction are we doing? So we're doing the Harbison. And so that's one thing that's unknown. The other thing that is unknown that we have to decide is, going back to the opening chorus, the gospel text is the words of Jesus. One has to ask the question, why didn't Bach set it as Vox Christi, or the voice of Christ, as a solo voice? Why not those words for a bass soloist in orchestra? My personal feeling, and again, this is all conjecture, is that the opening chorus is sort of a corporate, collective, communal statement of faith. And then we go to the personal statement of faith, which is the tenor aria. I think one of the interesting things, too, is that Bach chooses the exact same key, which is rare. It's so seldom do we go from a chorus that is that truncated, and then we start an aria in the exact same key. This is what leads me to believe that these are sort of dual, same statements, saying the same thing. One is communal, and one is the more private or personal statement of faith. And the text leads us to believe that the instrumentation, there's a real sort of intimacy, chamber feeling, tenderness to the tenor aria with violin. And this idea that, what is the text here? Oh, faith is the badge of love. And this is something that we actually talked about it with Pam Warrants and the Fellows, not directly related to this cantata, but which comes first, faith or love? Is it love that engenders faith, or faith that engenders love? And I think we constantly ask that question. And I think there's a lovingness to this, and I think that Bach is, the text is telling us that love is what inspires faith.
There's also some beautiful imagery here. We talks about the Liebestriebe, which is the sort of urgings, I've translated as promptings of love. But what's very beautiful, and if you were following closely, you heard how Bach caresses and keeps returning to this word Kleinod, which means a jewel. This, precious, small, exquisitely beautiful object, right? And what is that jewel, metaphorically? It is faith. So because Jesus loves the soul, he brings this gift to the soul, and the gift to the soul is the faith to believe in Jesus. The imagery of baptism doesn't appear in the tenor aria. We, of course, hear that word very significantly in the first movement, and we will return to the significance of baptism in the bass aria a little bit later. This, another Lutheran tenet, and of course, this starts to make us think of the great baptism cantata, Cantata 7, Christ der Herr zum Jordan kam, right? Where we see the emphasis placed on the sacrament of baptism as the way that you prove to your community that you have faith. And one aspect of this cantata that I've been pondering personally is there's something very loving and inclusive about these words, but there's also something exclusive about it. Because this idea that you have to show that you're in the in crowd, And if you don't have that little token, then we don't believe that you have faith. You have not demonstrated it. Wer gläubet und getauft wird, you've got to also be baptized. So that kind of means that hovering around the edges is this kind of the who's in and who's out.
And then this tenor aria leads us to, it's interesting they use the word Kleinod, which is jewel. It leads us to what I think is the jewel of the whole cantata, is this middle movement, which is essentially a chorale concerto for two voices, soprano and alto, with an independent continuo line. And it takes the entirety of the tune of Wie schön leuchtet der Morgenstern, and sometimes it's stated very clearly, and then you have sort of decorations that happen. And these two, soprano and alto, are chasing each other, not always knowing who's the lead voice. This was not a new idea per se. Johann Hermann Schein, who was Bach's predecessor as the cantor at the Thomaskirche nearly 100 years earlier, was sort of the first to write a chorale concerto for two voices, or even three voices. If you were here on the first Sunday of Advent, we did a chorale concerto for three voices on Nun kommt der Heiland by Johann Hermann Schein. What's different about this is those pieces by Schein, the continuo line was in a supportive role. In this piece, the continuo line has sort of a primary role, and they're completely independent. And buried in this, and it happens so quickly, the very first three notes of the continuo line are the first three notes of the tune. So, wie schön leuchtet, and that's the way the hymn tune starts, the chorale tune, and the very opening of the continuo line, bum, 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 those first three notes, about 3 times as fast. And then we hear it from the soprano, Herrgott, in canon, exactly 2 beats apart, but a canon in unison, 2 beats apart, the alto is following. And then these often change roles. Sometimes the alto's leading, sometimes the soprano's leading. And when they're not singing the tune, they're doing an ornamented or a decorated version of the tune. So it's a rather elaborate structure. 3 voices happening, 3 meaning the 2 voices, and the third being the continuo line, which is doing its own thing. One of the most interesting treatments, I think, of this chorale tune is the penultimate phrase where it's himmlisch Leben wird ergeben. And the alto starts it and the soprano finishes it. It's not even that there's a canon or that they're chasing it, but the soprano finishes it and up an octave. So you hear himmlisch Leben wird ergeben. Even an octave higher, obviously not in my range, but up there. So one of the things I was talking to the singers about is how can we find a different color, a different way, so that we, as though we're putting this chorale tune in bold, which is exactly what Pam does in her translations, is a way, how do we, bold caps, how do we make the chorale tune have real presence?
And I would just point out a couple of other delightful things. When the 2 singers enter the first time, they're pretty much exactly in the same register. I always am so fascinated when Bach writes duets, how he plays off similarity and difference. So with alto soprano, of course, they're very close to each other. And we can, I don't think it's necessary, but certainly we can say, oh, well, they were 2 boys whose voices hadn't changed in a slightly different register, a higher soprano boy and a lower alto boy. So you can certainly imagine that their colors could be very similar. I think that doesn't change that much when you have 2 women singing. But then the second statement, the alto then takes the lead, and the soprano immediately jumps in an octave higher. So suddenly we have this separation of registers. I think the playfulness of sort of finding yourself on long notes, which are chorale tune notes, and then suddenly breaking out and singing decoration is, it's infectious, it's joyous, and it's incredibly playful. Another interesting thing, particularly for those of you who like to study scores, so this is 12/8. So everything is, divided in 3. But there are things that look very much duple when you look at the score. So there's another decision that has to be made for a performer. Do I continue to try to make everything sound like triplets, right? Or should I try to actually move into a duple feeling for a beat or two? I've done it both ways, actually. And that sounds very complicated to suddenly impose a duple feeling over a triple. I hope people know what I mean when I say that. It's sort of like a ya da 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 da, right? A person who does a lot of work in other composers from the 18th century would pretty much lean towards keeping the triplet feeling and shifting the notation so that it conforms. So dum da da dum instead of dum da da dum, right? But it is very interesting to try both and to sort of understand what you gain and what you lose. In another context, sometimes Bach will very much superimpose these two, and we have sometimes even speculated that what he's showing us is the triple being the divinity and the duple being the humanity. In other words, the two natures of Christ. I'm not really sure he's doing that here because this piece isn't really talking about that. But my point is, don't be too quick to come up with a decision about duples and triples. You might want to take a really close look at the score because there could be some value in maintaining the duple in those measures. But it's another mystery and another sort of game.
Last thing I'll say about this duet is that there's this sense of the Christian, there are two voices, and that's the Christian soul sort of in dialogue with itself in a way. And so that's why we hear these canons and one part starting in one octave, the next voice finishing the thought. And there's like an evolution throughout this duet. And it comes to the end on the word praise, loben, where I think the soul is finally in union with itself, and the soprano and alto finally move in parallel motion in these sixths that dance about and take us to the end of this movement, which then leads us into the sort of, I would say, almost most emblematic bedrock of the Lutheran faith in a recitative that we hear in Bach, and dare I say, like my predecessor in all of Bach. But this is really here where you mortals, how long do you like me long to gaze upon the face of God? And he asks the question, and he uses a Phrygian cadence, so there's this sort of plunging down to G natural and then a resolution to it. And then he says, if you do, you can't just rely on your good works. Even though a Christian must practice these good works, yes, you should do that. But because that is the earnest will of God or the sincere will of God. But yet faith alone is the only thing that assures that we are righteous and blessed before God. And when I was rehearsing with Will Propestus, our bass soloist, we talked a lot about how do you make the moment of, so there's this big sort of preamble that leads us to, yet faith alone is the thing that assures us the righteousness. And how do we make that, how do we draw our ear to it? And we both decided that it would be far more interesting to sort of pull back, to make the listener lean forward to listen, to really, so what we did there is we took a little extra time, we placed the chord, and he sang it more softly as a way to make the point of this is the thing that really matters.
And as Ryan mentioned earlier, it is a recitative, but it is not a secco recitative. We hear the strings playing along with the singer, sort of fleshing out the chords. And as we often sort of kind of feel, it's almost like a halo. You know, in the St. Matthew Passion, when all the words of Jesus are accompanied by the strings, it almost literally feels like that halo. I mean, here, the singer is not, I don't think we're meant to hear the voice of Jesus. I think we hear someone contemporary with us, perhaps our preacher, or just a fellow soul saying, you know, this is what I understand, this is what I know to be true. But I also think there's very little doubt that having those string sort of, you know, again, an octave or more above the voice, which is obviously in the bass register, it adds this solemnity to it. It basically says, these are words you must really listen to. Whereas if it were a secco recitative, I think there would be more of a sense of, okay, I have some things I need to tell you, and then I'm going to sing a beautiful aria. But now it's like, and after that marvelous game, so filled with, you know, play and joy, we suddenly are being arrested by, okay, now let's talk about this absolutely essential thing you must do. We told you God gave you a jewel, and now we've sort of celebrated that, and now I'm going to say, make sure your faith is pure.
And in terms of the structure of the piece, I mentioned this at the outset, that there are no secco recitatives, which really is somewhat of a rarity. It's not often that we have a Bach cantata that does not have secco recitatives. Maybe of some of the earlier Weimar pieces that were more through composed in that way, but in terms of, while he's in Leipzig, very, very few. So I think he chooses the one recitative and gives it this halo of strings as a way, again, to highlight the importance of what the singer is trying to convey. And then it leads us to this, I find it very complex and interesting aria. And Bach often works in groups of threes. Is it the Trinity? We don't know, but works in groups of threes. The opening chorus had three motives that were in dialogue and on top of each other. The soprano-alto duet is in 12/8, which is a compound meter divided by threes. And it was essentially a three-voice texture, two voices in the continuo. In this aria, it's a slightly different structure than we hear in many arias. We're used to hearing, you know, often a da capo aria, ABA. What's interesting about this aria is that the instrumental material, with some variations, essentially stays the same. All the motives are present throughout. The vocal material, there are clearly three different ideas. And they're based, if you read John's notes, it's brilliant, that there are three different nouns that he's modifying, as it were, musically. The first is faith, and he talks about it gives them wings to soar to heaven. That's the big first phrase. The second phrase talks about baptism, which is the grace that brings God's blessings, which is in many ways is the same theme as the opening chorus. And then the third thing is blessed, and blessed is the Christian who believes and is baptized. Will, the baritone soloist, and I talked again about how do you make these three sections very different when the instrumental material is very much the same, and we have these recurring motives. You hear in the opening, not in the sort of obligato line, which is the melodic line in the oboe and the first violins, but the continuo and the inner voices do this ya-pa-pa, pa-pa-pa, pa-pa-pa, pa-pa-pa. It's sort of a heartbeat, but I also think it recalls back to something you talked about, Pam, is in that tenor aria, the badge of faith or the badge of baptism. And it almost feels like there's the sort of tattoo, pop-up, that's on you, that's being imprinted upon you, a reminder of the importance of belief and faith for salvation.
And Bach, I think, also does some beautiful word painting in this aria when he talks about the wings that will soar to heaven. He gives the bass this sort of beautiful roulade. You know, there are many words musicians use for strings of notes, right? Coloratura, melisma, right? Roulade is another one of those words. And obviously it has this sort of connotation of rolling. And I think the way this writing, that's a nice description of these kinds of strings of 16th notes, is that they feel like they're rolling, but they're also sort of floating on the breeze, right? This idea of having wings and maybe catching a thermal and hovering like a big eagle or a hawk. That is one of the most beautiful things about this piece. I mean, it's certainly a much more serious tone. That tone that we started with, that accompagnato recit, now has moved into the sort of seriousness of this piece. But at the same time, there's a very strong sense of positivity. You know, this is for you if you will take it. You know, if you can adopt these things, the faith and the baptism, blessing is yours. So it's sort of like almost like a syllogism, right?
And one final thing about this aria, this is more directed towards our students, but everybody. And when you have a chance, take a look at the score. The final melisma, or roulade, that the baritone sings has very interesting phrase groupings. And Will and I both agree that that it is in 3 groups. Again, there's that number 3 groups of 12 16th notes, which work against the bar line. It's yup, up, 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 beep, up, 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 up. You would think it would be by the bar line, but it's these 3 groups so Bach is working against the bar line, and at the end of it, it gets lower and lower and lower. And I really believe this is, being submerged in the baptismal waters. A little bit of like, you're not wet enough, let's go a little bit lower. Make sure this sticks, make sure this works. And then they emerge, and there's the end of the aria. Which leads us then to the final chorale, which we heard snippets of it in the opening chorus. Phrases in the opening chorus are based on this final chorale. And the opening line, Den Glauben mit Verleihe an dein Sohn Jesu Christ, which is, grant me faith in your Son Jesus Christ, which seems like a very, sincere, simple prayer. And yet, Bach changes the chorale tune at the very outset, and the second bar shifts to minor when the actual tune is in major. And I think this is Bach's own representation of how difficult faith is, how difficult this journey is. The very next phrase, 2 phrases later, talks about, and forgive me all of my sins at this time. And the chorale tune is unadorned. He goes back to it being cadencing in major. There's an E major cadence. But underneath it, the alto tenor and the bass are this thorny chromaticism, and there's even a descending, the Baroque word for the passus durisculus, which is like the difficult passage or the difficult way. This descending chromatic bass line. Again, showing us how hard it is maybe to forgive our own sins, but to forgive sins in others as well.
If you take a close look at the score, you really will be astonished at how many accidentals and cross relations or notes that are in one, like a natural in one part and then a sharp in a different part, like on the very next beat, or places where the accidental is canceled or altered from one beat to the next. And I think if you were listening, you could hear that. It's turbulent, right? And I agree with Ryan that this is a way that Bach uses harmony to remind us that these are ongoing things. These aren't things that you had that baptism when you were a kid, and now you're all set. So I say you believe in that, and now you can just coast through life, and that it is definitely not the way Bach sees it. And this morning I was really struck by, it's not until we get to the second to last phrase dass mein Sünd zu tragen, that he will bear my sins. This is the first phrase in the chorale that is completely consonant. And it's so beautiful, and it's such a relief to just hear A major. We heard so much beautiful A major at the beginning of the cantata, and things got difficult. And it's not until the second to last phrase of the chorale that we finally hear a simple diatonic rise from A to E. And then, of course, the final phrase continues in that sort of resolution mode. So he really makes us wait. And of course, this is Bach being a master of the chorale form by finding how much he can pack in terms of theological messaging, emotional messaging, and just sort of musical density to drive his point home.
Questions? We could take questions if anybody has any at this point about the cantata or anything else, especially from our fellows.
So just raise your hand. We'll have an extra mic that we can use. We're miking, yes, I know it's a small room, but this way our people on our live stream will also be able to hear very clearly your questions. So wait for the microphone to come to you and raise your hand if you would like to ask a question.
I was wondering whether there were any kind of trends about the difference between Bach's writing when he was younger and middle and older, or in different churches and so forth. I guess this question came to mind when you said that this setting for the Ascension Sunday was so much simpler and quieter than the last three. So do you notice anything about this cantata that really kind of places it in this time of Bach's life, and if so, why?
I'll say a few things and then you can add to it. I mean, there certainly is, to my ear and what I see on the page, a big difference between Bach's writing, say, for example, his earlier stuff when he was in Köthen or in Weimar, or like the very early ones like the cantata in Mühlhausen, which was 1707. And here we are now in Leipzig, 1724, and I think when he gets to Leipzig, he's really, I think he finally feels I'm at a place where I'm supposed to be and I want to do this. You know, he talked about having regulated church music, and he's thinking more methodically, knowing he has to create a cantata for every Sunday of the church year. This is the first time that we know of that he had that obligation. And what I have observed and discovered is that I feel like these years in Leipzig, or when these first 3 years, it's really I feel like it's his laboratory. And he's working stuff out. He's testing things, trying to figure out what can I do, and what can I do with the people I have around me. And when I mentioned that following cantatas for Ascension Sunday, they were after that, where they added trumpets and drums. But then the later one, the Ascension cantata, oratorio, was 11 years after this. It was 1735. And at this point, which we've talked a lot about this in the Bach Institute, because so much of what we're doing now is about parody. And a lot of the parody works are later, because they're parodies from secular works that he did. And as he gets later in his style, he's exploring more of a galant style, or a more popular style, as it were. And because he's Bach and brilliant, he finds a way in the galant style to make it as complex and interesting as his more learned style.
So you can also identify, I agree with Ryan, everything that, you know, the very early cantatas have a almost 17th century structure where they don't have recits. Sometimes they flow smoothly from one movement to the next. They're often, the libretti themselves are often entirely biblical, or biblical and chorale, but no original poetry. This early period in Leipzig, which is basically 2023, I did that before, 1723 through about 1726 seems to be a period where he is doing his most experimental work. But it's so different. You can't look at a piece and say, I recognize the hallmarks of that the 20s period, except that it is so radical, right? And to just open up on the galant question, so Bach was becoming criticized as the tastes in music were changing and wanting a more open texture with a sort of more crystalline, melodic, highlighted structure and a simpler, slower harmonic motion underneath, which starts to make us think of a little bit Mozart, a little bit classical period, right? The sort of tastes and the techniques of composing music, whether it's instrumental or vocal, were changing very rapidly in this period in the 18th century. Some people were starting to say Bach's music is very old-fashioned. It's very turgid and complex, and he really didn't like those criticisms. And one of the ways he responded to it was with the cantata, the contest between Phoebus and Pan, which we've talked about. But he also responded to that pressure, and when he moved into a different part of his career where he was writing more secular music in the 1730s, he is clearly trying it, and I think trying to put his stamp on it, to say, I can do it, but I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to do it with the interesting harmonies and with the extra voices, but I can write a tune as well as anyone else. What has been interesting for us in the Bach Institute is because we're looking at repertoire that is largely from that later period, we are really finding the way that the composer's language has changed, exactly as you asked. The cantata repertoire, whether it's sacred or secular, from the middle of the 1730s and going into the 1740s, I would say there's a very marked difference in the compositional style.
I noticed one thing in the rehearsal, in the bass aria, when you just had the strings playing. It seemed almost classical in style. And then, but the oboe and bass line were so Baroque.
It's interesting you say that because I think it's the repeated motive, ya-pa-pa, pa-pa-pa, pa-pa-pa, which makes us think that it's almost this little Morse code message that comes across, and it's these motives. Every once in a while, Bach would get hooked on them. I'm thinking of, is it Cantata Herr wie du willst, bum, bim, bum, bum, that three-note motive that comes through, and he would seize upon a motive that would be sort of omnipresent throughout a movement or even throughout a whole cantata, almost leitmotivic in that way. And I think that one little thing might have been the thing that leads you to believe that. But you're right. Then you had the bass line, and it's clearly Baroque music, and this very decorated, very sort of ornate, florid melodic line on top of it.
Although I think there's a little tiny hint of Handel in that aria too. There's something that Handel does really, really well, this sort of nobility and the sense of sort of marshaled forces that move together. We don't see that kind of writing in Bach a lot, actually. But this piece, I think, is a little closer to that world than maybe some other pieces. Not that Handel is classical, of course, but...
You mentioned instances where Bach would use what was probably intended to be an aria text for a recit or vice versa. I'm not sure. I was just wondering if you had particular examples of that and why you think he would do that.
The things I'm thinking about are from some earlier pieces where something is kind of almost looks in the libretto like it's meant to be an aria, and Bach sets it in a kind of a recit style. You know, when you ask why, it's always the hardest question to answer, right? I think that the best way to answer that question, if you yourself are a musician, is to ask yourself, what effect does this have? To take a text that seems, say, as an aria's text, very regular structure, rhyming lines and things like that, and say, if I'm singing it as a recit, and I'm sort of allowing the prosody, the rhetoric to be loosened more like speech, what do I gain and what do I lose, right? I'm going to now open this out a little farther to those of you who may not be practicing musicians. This, I think, is one of the fascinating things about how musicians need to make strong decisions and commit to them, no matter whether we have an answer for what the composer's intention was. You can see how in the course of today's talk, we have a lot of evidence about what the composer's intention was, and we want to know that. Everyone always wants to know, what is the composer's intention? But especially in the looking back to the 18th century, there are times we can't know. So then we're stuck with, how do we perform this music? If we're afraid to do something that might not have been the composer's intention, we sort of handcuff ourselves. And the only other solution is to say, I need to inform myself as well as possible. And then I need to make a strong decision, commit to it, and then make it work as well as I possibly can. So this question, which is a small scale thing, recits versus arias and how they might be set, is probably not the most troubling of those types of decisions, but I think it's representative of how we then move forward and say, I've selected this tempo, I've selected this dynamic profile, I'm choosing to see this entire movement from this emotional perspective, and therefore I'm going to make decisions that bring that emotion forward, that type of thing. When we don't have a letter by Bach saying, this piece is about, you know, the sadness of something, right?
The only thing I would add to that, just briefly, and then Will, you're up, is what I find interesting is I mean, the recitatives in the aria, I'm trying to decide that, but when he does this sort of almost like Zwischen structure of the arioso, that'll happen often at the end of a recitative, and clearly he's wanting to highlight a certain text. And when I look at that there's the I part of it, that you look at it on the page, and that's the thing that I think is often interesting, is looking at something and trying to determine now which one of these. If you look at the libretto before you look at the score, and to try to in your head envision and figure out how's Bach going to set this, which it's hard for me to do now that I've done them all, but I used to sometimes read Pam's libretti, her translations, before I even looked at a score, to try to think how I would have done it or what I think it's going to be.
And I'm just going to jump in here and say, I did some of that translating with less familiarity of the music, and some with great familiarity. And sometimes I would be listening to the cantata after I had translated, and it was like, oh, now I know what it means. The music kind of would clarify things that I would be reading just as a German poem, and just go, okay, these are the words, and this is what I'm thinking the intent is, and then I'll realize, actually, no, the intent was different. So that's actually an excellent exercise, I think, for all of you fellows, to just engage the libretto without the music and see where you think Bach might go, and then go and look and see what he actually did. We'll take your question now.
Well, just branching off of that concept of not being able to know what the composer's original intention is. In relation to the tenor aria, how would one approach the process of reconstruction, and why are there so many versions?
There might be so many versions because there's so many composers.
Not being a composer myself, I can only guess. Because we have the continuo line, and we have figures, so we know what were the implied harmonies. That's the first thing. Second thing is often almost always an obligato instrumental line is based on motives that we hear in the voice later. So in this case, we hear that opening motive in the violin because the tenor's going to sing it later. Usually the instrument introduces the melodic structure and the fragments that we're going to hear later on. And then what I think, particularly what John does well in his, is that he not only picks up vocal fragments, but he'll take little motives that we hear in the continuo line. The opening motive is very simple, right? And later on, the violin takes those little motives and finds places where, see, even sometimes they're in sixth or in thirds, sort of in a little loving, cradling duet with the voice or with the continuo. So I would love to ask John or Bob Levin or Suzuki how they did these things, because there are a lot of similarities in these three specific ones I'm speaking about, but then there are also things that are wildly different, like the way that John ends the B section, where he brings back a motive from the A section in a completely different key and somehow winds his way back to the dominant to get us ending the B section that leads us back to the A.
I was wondering about the source material for this particular cantata. Which of these parts, because you said that one's missing, are actually in Bach's hand, or whose hands are they in, and where do they reside, if they all reside in one place, like Berlin or wherever?
That's a very interesting question, because with very few exceptions, as I understand it, the parts were not in Bach's hand. They were in the hand of a copyist, which also meant that there were probably mistakes. You can imagine what the timeline was, especially in this period in Leipzig, this 3-year period where, you finished one cantata on Sunday morning and you had very few days to get the manuscript of the score for the next cantata, get the parts copied, get them to the instrumentalists and to the singers, have them learn their part, and then rehearse it. So I think it's inherent to there might be some mistakes. I mean, it can be something simple as is that dot an errant bit of ink? So, like I said, the copyists are the ones that made the parts. So we do have, obviously, the digital archive has Bach's manuscript, and we also have a lot of the parts in the digital archive, which is always an interesting thing too, because we can see the evolution of the parts from one performance to the next. Sometimes we see changes that were made.
And that brings up another aspect of this, which is what has come down to us? What have we lost, and what do we have? And this is, I think, the greatest tragedy in Bach scholarship is the certain knowledge of about a third of the cantatas that he wrote being lost to history. And why? Why were they lost to history? Partly because after his death, the collection of material was divided among his sons, and Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, his second son, was a marvelous steward of his music and created an incredible catalog and preserved all the parts. But his oldest son, Wilhelm Friedmann, had a much more checkered history, was frequently in debt, and it seems that sometimes the way that he would get out of debt would be to sell off some of his inheritance, including some of the scores that he got from his father. So we sometimes don't have something in Bach's autograph hand. We sometimes don't have an existing manuscript, only parts that we can then need to be reconstructed to create a score. And that is why, even when we're fortunate enough, we didn't lose Cantata 37, but we lost pieces of it, right? And so that's precisely why we don't know there was clearly something that played it, but we just don't. And it wasn't Bach's intention for that to be discarded, but it's part of this, after death history that, just kind of makes us all mourn internally when we think about what's been lost. Again, in a study of parody works, we are finding ourselves frequently talking about pieces that are speculated to exist and what they might have sounded like when we don't know anything about them, like the St. Mark Passion, for instance. Or other works that were speculated to be lost models for things, like that last chorus in the Christmas oratorio. I mean, the last section of the Christmas oratorio is speculated to be completely parodied from a previous piece, but we don't have that piece. So as far as we're concerned, that's all new music.
So we were talking just a little bit about how we have these quotes throughout the cantata from Wie schön leuchtet. And I was curious how you guys approach music that has these quotations from other cantatas in it, and like how that informs the way that you make like artistic decisions with the cantata. Yeah.
If you look at, if one were to look at all the second Jahrgang, 1724 to 1725, which was, we think of as the chorale cantata year, when Bach was seeking to have a cantata for every Sunday and every feast day of the church year that was based on a chorale. One of the things that, and if you look at those cantatas and you look at Pam's translations, Pam codes them beautifully, and we see whenever there is the chorale text, and she puts it in bold, right? Yes. And I always think that this is all preamble to your question, especially when I'm doing a chorale cantata, which even though this isn't a chorale cantata, when there's a chorale tune present, in my mind, I'm always thinking that in Bach's time, the chorale tune was something the congregation knew. For the most part, it was a source of familiarity to them. I often use the example, I think many of you, regardless of any sort of faith vocabulary you have, if I started singing, you heard the words, right? I didn't say any words, you heard the words. That's the way I always perceive Bach's congregation felt when something like, even though we never hear the words Wie schön leuchtet der Morgenstern ever in this cantata. We hear different verses of it, but no doubt Bach's congregation was hearing that in their head. I've always believed. So I don't know if I'm directly answering your question, other than to say whenever there is a chorale tune, it's a matter of making it present in a way that the listener can grab onto it. And also, I'm sort of incessantly interested in the verses that are not the ones people know. And often, like in a chorale cantata, one of the great things Bach will do is take one, like let's say it's, let's see, what's a good example? One of the ones about Nimm von uns, Cantata 101, there's a bass recitative that has little chorale tropes in there. So it's a recitative, and then you'll get a little line of chorale tune embedded in a recitative. And you may not get the whole chorale tune, you may not get all the chorale text, it might be a line from the fourth verse, the second stanza of the fourth verse, this little tune, and how do you highlight that? How do you make the listener, and is it that it's slower? Is it more rhythmically normal? Is there a different color? Is there a different sound? Any other questions? Oh, yeah, Sophia.
This is related to just what we were just talking about with the chorales. But do you ever look at, especially like the organ works where he has like chorale fantasies and things to inform how, like, I don't know, phrasing and interpretation. Like, for example, the third movement in the 37, it's very similar to, I think some things are similar, with one of the chorale fantasies that uses the same chorale melody.
I would say yes, and our founder, Craig Smith, on some of his longer essays, actually takes time to really examine multiple organ fantasias to see how Bach treats certain chorale tunes and kind of what events in the chorale are significant and always seem to be highlighted, and where he might make a huge change in his interpretation of the tune. Sometimes movements from the chorales get repurposed as organ pieces. It doesn't happen so much the other way, that he'll take an existing organ fantasy or organ prelude and then decide to stick it into a vocal piece. I think it usually goes the other way. Our fellows are discovering that in non-organ preludes, Bach sometimes will take instrumental music and bring it into a vocal context. I'm speaking now to our non-fellows. I hope you stick around for the rest of our week, because since we are looking at parody, we're going to be showing you and discussing some very fascinating examples of how Bach decides to repurpose music, whether it's one vocal piece to another or an instrumental piece into a vocal piece, etc. So absolutely, that is a very fruitful avenue to see how Bach treats a chorale in a very different context. And I think maybe on that note, we should wrap up a wonderful, stimulating afternoon, and I'd like to invite you to our next public event. Of course, tomorrow morning, as part of the Emmanuel Church service, we will be presenting Cantata BWV 37, so I hope you will come to that. But then on Monday evening, we have a brilliant musicologist, David Schulenberg, who will be talking to us about new words for old music, and he'll be giving us a really detailed overview of Bach's parody technique. And that will be 7 p.m. here in the music room. Thank you.